Let me tell you the story of a man named Amos. He was just an ordinary shepherd from a little village called Tekoa. He wasn't a king, a priest, or even a scholar. He was a simple man doing his work when God called him to do something extraordinary. God chose Amos to deliver a powerful and uncomfortable message, not only to Israel but to the nations around it. At that time, Israel was enjoying great prosperity. The people were wealthy, their cities were growing, and life seemed good. But underneath the surface, things were very wrong. The rich were exploiting the poor, justice was for sale, and the people had turned away from God to worship idols. Amos was sent to speak out against all these wrongs, and his words were not easy to hear. Amos began by addressing the sins of the nations surrounding Israel. He called out their evil deeds one by one, showing that God sees all and judges all fairly. Let's listen to Amos's words as he delivered God's judgment against Israel's neighbors. First, Amos spoke about Damascus, the capital of Aram. God said, "For 3 sins of Damascus, even for 4, I will not relent." This was a way of saying their sins were countless. Damascus had committed brutal acts of violence, especially against the people of Gilead. They threshed Gilead with sharp iron tools, treating human lives like crops to be destroyed. Because of this, God declared, "I will send fire on the house of Hazael, and it will consume the fortresses of Ben-Hadad. Their cities would be destroyed, and their power would crumble." Next, Amos turned to Gaza, a city of the Philistines. He said, "For 3 sins of Gaza, even for 4, I will not relent." Gaza had captured entire communities and sold them into slavery, treating people as commodities. God's punishment? "I will send fire on the walls of Gaza that will consume her fortresses." The Philistine cities, including Ashdod and Ekron, would face devastation. Then, Amos spoke about Tyre, a wealthy city known for its trade. Tyre had broken a covenant of brotherhood by handing over captives to Edom. God declared, "I will send fire on the walls of Tyre that will consume her fortresses." Even a city as rich and powerful as Tyre would not escape judgment. The next nation was Edom, a relative of Israel, descended from Esau. Edom had pursued Israel with unrelenting anger, showing no mercy and refusing to let go of their hatred. God's punishment was clear. "I will send fire on Teman that will consume the fortresses of Bozrah." Their pride and hostility would lead to their downfall. Amos then turned to Ammon, a nation guilty of horrific crimes. They ripped open pregnant women in Gilead to expand their borders, a shocking act of cruelty. God said, "I will set fire to the walls of Rabbah that will consume her fortresses." Their leaders and armies would face destruction. Finally, Amos condemned Moab, who desecrated the bones of the king of Edom, reducing them to ashes. This act showed total disrespect for human dignity. God declared, "I will send fire on Moab that will consume the fortresses of Kerioth." Their leaders would be destroyed, and the nation would fall. The people of Israel must have felt comfortable as Amos condemned their enemies. They probably thought, "Yes, those nations deserve punishment." But then, Amos did something unexpected. He turned his message to Judah and Israel themselves. First, he addressed Judah, the southern kingdom. Amos said, "For 3 sins of Judah, even for 4, I will not relent." Judah had rejected God's law and turned to false gods, following the lies of their ancestors. Their punishment? "I will send fire on Judah that will consume the fortresses of Jerusalem." Even God's chosen people were not above his judgment if they disobeyed him. Then came the most shocking part of Amos's message, judgment against Israel, the northern kingdom. God's chosen people, who should have been a light to the nations, were just as guilty as their neighbors, or worse. Amos listed Israel's sins in detail. They sold the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They trampled on the heads of the poor and denied justice to the oppressed. Fathers and sons dishonored God by sleeping with the same woman, and sacred places were polluted by immorality. The wealthy lived in luxury, drinking wine in expensive cups and lying on ivory beds, while the poor struggled to survive. Amos reminded them of God's kindness in the past. He had brought them out of Egypt, protected them in the wilderness, and given them the land they lived in. He had even sent prophets and Nazirites to guide them, but they rejected his guidance. Because of all this, Amos declared that Israel's punishment would be severe. God said, "I will crush you as a cart crushes when loaded with grain." Their military strength, wealth, and power would not save them. Their cities would be destroyed, and their people would be taken away into exile. Despite these harsh words, Amos's message wasn't without hope. He urged the people, "Seek the Lord and live." He told them to let justice roll on like a river and righteousness like a never-failing stream. Amos called them to true repentance, not empty rituals, but real change in their hearts and actions. God wasn't just angry with their sins, He wanted them to turn back to Him. He wanted them to be a nation that cared for the poor, upheld justice, and worshipped Him sincerely. Now, you might wonder, what does this mean for us today? Amos's message is still relevant because the issues he addressed, corruption, injustice, and empty worship, are still with us. A strong nation isn't built on wealth or power alone. It's built on fairness, compassion, and integrity. When leaders exploit the vulnerable, when justice is sold to the highest bidder, and when people forget their responsibility to care for one another, a nation begins to crumble. Amos reminds us that justice and righteousness are the foundation of a healthy society. So, what can we learn from Amos? We can learn that every one of us has a role to play in building a just and fair community. Whether we are leaders, workers, or neighbors, we must treat others with respect, stand up against injustice, and live lives that honor God. Let us take Amos's words to heart. Let us make sure that justice rolls on like a river and righteousness flows like a never-failing stream. In doing so, we can build a society that is not only strong but also pleasing to God.